Hello, Ingrid. How are you?
Hi, Jamie. I'm fine. I hope you are too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an honor to have you join me as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. So thank you for making the time. And as we've talked about briefly, it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest and most important philosophical questions. What's real and what should we believe about the universe we all share? And as importantly, who matters when we're thinking about ethics? And I'm answering those two questions with an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this very simple worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that when we're thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason, maybe a scientific way of understanding the world, to try and work out what's true and what isn't. And when it comes to the ethical question, the question of ethical scope, the clue is in the name. We should have moral consideration or compassion for every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to experience, to suffer, to flourish. But I'm talking in these conversations with people who both agree and disagree with different aspects of that. So I have my suspicions about where we might end up, but it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey. But before we get to those big questions, for the rare people who don't know you and your work already, how would you best introduce yourself these days?
I'm Ingrid Newkirk. I'm the founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, often mispronounced as PETA. It depends where you are in the world. We were founded 40 years ago, 41 this year, and we are the largest animal rights organization in the world, which to me is not encouraging. I would like others to be much bigger, and I would like us to be much bigger too, because it's a big world out there. But I work every day trying to push forward the animal rights agenda, which I believe is good for animals, good for human beings who are animals anyway, and good for the earth, good for everything.
That's great. Thank you. And as part of that work, you've written and published many books, including the one I can see behind you, the 30-year edition of Free the Animals too. So
Yes, I've been very lucky to have good publishers. And I think I've got 14 books out now,
wow.
some about dog care and cat care and why we should respect them because so many people have dogs and cats, but also a lot of books about kindness and what we can do in our own lives that make an enormous difference. And things about individuals who have decided that something bothered them and have set out to change it and have succeeded. And then my most recent one, After Animal Kind, which was talking about the similarities, how we are all sentient and how we all count, is Free the Animals, which is the story of the Animal Liberation Front in North America. It was obviously busy in England and other places before it came to the United States, but this is the story of its origins here in the US.
Yeah, that's great. And it'll be interesting to talk about, I guess, their work and that style of work when we come back to this final question about how do we make the world a better place? Because there are so many different tools we can choose and so many different levers we can pull on, and much fiery debate over which are the best to use, of course. So let's come on to this first question. What's real and what and how should we believe? So for many of my guests, this is a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a more naturalistic, scientifically minded context, family and society, or one that was more religious or spiritual or mystical in some sense, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell us how your epistemology started out, maybe the one you were given, and how that's developed over time and why.
Well, of course, we are all creatures of our upbringings to some extent. And when I was born to a very sort of Victorian oriented father, a very strict disciplinarian father, and a very, very kind mother who everybody said would give you the shirt off her back. So I had two kind of contrasts there. I think they were creatures of their own upbringing. That's how they were supposed to be. I was not really raised very much by them because they traveled very much. My father was a navigational engineer. And so he was often overseas, and sometimes we were overseas with them, but he was often away. So I was shipped out to boarding schools and raised by some disciplinarian nuns and actually rejected their domination And so I think that might have contributed to my idea that you shouldn't put down those who are powerless. You should fight for them and seek justice. I think in retrospect, they were quite bitter. They were Irish nuns who had been pretty much sent away by their families. In those days, families were very large and there were a lot of mouths to feed. And poor Irish families used to basically give a daughter into the convent and a son into the priesthood. And then they'd been shipped overseas and they resented it. So they took it out on the little rich girls they had to tutor.
Yeah.
So we were very naughty. And I believe that grounded me in being able to speak up, fight anything I didn't like, be rebellious in a way, and not like injustice. My earliest memories are of having a dog in the house when I was born and as I grew up, and he was like my brother. And so to me, it wasn't as if he was a different species. He was just my pal, my brother, my family member. And I came to understand when he was sad and understand when he was joyful, and he to me. So that was a good grounding too.
Yeah.
But
So it sounds like that experience, and you're demonstrating something that is always a challenge in these conversations, is I sometimes try and artificially separate the epistemology and the ethics, and it's so hard to do and probably doesn't even make sense in many contexts because they're so richly interwoven. But you certainly had that early experience of, I guess, domination, if you like, or some form of oppression and challenge to justice from the schools you were sent to. And you had that hint of cross-species solidarity with the dog you shared your home with too. On the strict epistemology side, you clearly pushed back against the nuns' behaviour towards you. But what did you think of the things they were telling you about the universe, reality, God, and humanity's place in that? What did you think of the epistemological stuff they were telling you? And did you also get some of those messages from your parents? Because I'm assuming your parents at least had some default sort of religious background.
My parents, again, as I suppose pretty typical of the time, would go to church on Sunday. And when I was with them, I would go to church too. We went to Sunday school. It never really stuck with me. There was a time when I was lured into a little religious, I suppose, religiosity. But I think that was just a passing phase, just as I might have wished to join a motorcycle gang. It just seemed exciting at the time, the thing to do, but it wasn't really intellectually thought through. I rejected what the nuns said because they were so ghastly.
Yeah.
And that maybe they said something useful, but it was a very small universe of Roman Catholicism. And we were on our knees at 6:00 in the morning, every morning as the Angelus rang, and we were hustled downstairs so that we could pray in the chapel. We had a lot of prayer, a lot of silence, which was supposed to be the contemplation. And we girls rejected it. We, whispered and talked and gossiped and carried on, and we didn't respect the nuns because they were so harsh, because they were barbaric in their treatment, even of the little kids who were there, these tiny 5 and 6 year olds who would cry themselves to sleep. The nuns just were very callous. So we rejected their religious teachings. We also had Jesuits who came into the school, and one of the Jesuit priests made one of the girls pregnant. So that didn't really help forward their belief either. So I really, for a while, I would cross the road if I saw a nun coming in the other direction after I was grown up. I just didn't want anything to do with them or religion.
Yeah, just viscerally rejected the whole package.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, I did have this idea that, well, maybe there was a God and maybe there was something to religion. And so I read the Bible carefully. I did go to services. I did listen. I did think I might wish to become part of that. And ultimately, I completely rejected it. I thought it made no sense at all. That if there is a God, it must be an awfully cruel God or a powerless God who can't stop suffering on earth. So I just rejected it. And today, if you ask me, I would say I am probably a member of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, if you know what that is.
I do. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a colander that you wear for formal occasions, or have you not quite gone to that level?
I think only men wear the colander and have the eye patch. I'm not sure. But no, I don't carry it very far. I just think I'm not afraid to say, I'm not a person who says they're agnostic. I'm not afraid to say I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
I am an atheist. And I bond with other people who are atheists, like Ricky Gervais and Bill Maher and so on, who I feel that they're not kowtowing, they're not intimidated, and they can speak up on many issues. And I do believe speaking up on issues is vital. We're not in a country where our fingernails are going to be torn out and we're going to be imprisoned for life for saying what we believe. And yet many people are worried, nervous to speak out.
Yeah, yeah. And it's and the path you followed is interesting, and I think it's reasonably common. The reaction is one that is actually against the institutions and the people of a church, and you reject the package. But then you go back later and think maybe it was just the people, maybe it was just the institution. So I'll have another look at the books and other ways of interpreting these things. And some people do find some value there and find a different reconciliation with it. But like you, I followed the same path. It was a combination of both seeing some ethical challenges, whether it was sexism, anti-Semitism, cruelty to others, almost sort of reveling in the suffering of others sometimes, a sort of glorification of sacrifice that bled over into actually a willingness to harm others, which is certainly not universal across religions. Most religious people, I think, genuinely have a deep, rich, universal compassion, but I saw enough of those ethical problems for that to become a challenge. But then there was this combination of an intellectual exploration of is this thing coherent when you look at the reality of the world and different explanations for it, different religious explanations and naturalistic explanations. So it does seem interesting that there's this combination of a sort of intellectual evidence and reason rejection and also a rejection of the ethical implications too.
Well, it was interesting in school because perhaps there were other ways they could have put things. But if you ever had a question about religion, the nuns and the priests would always say, if they couldn't answer it, they would say, well, that's a mystery. And the concept of a mystery is part of church teachings. So in other words, we haven't the faintest clue. You must accept it on face value as a mystery. The other thing they would do is tell us far-fetched stories, which were about, a person goes to church and they're given communion and they secret away the communion wafer, take it back to their home, and in the privacy of their room, they bite into it to see if it really is the blood of Christ. And blood gushes out and fills the room and they drown. And you would think, this is just absurd.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they believed those things themselves or they had blind faith themselves or what it was, but it certainly wasn't convincing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting counterpoint to the last conversation I've just released with Lisa Kemmerer. And I think you've written a chapter in one of the Sister Species anthologies she wrote. So I'm sure you know each other. But we had a fascinating conversation because my default stance is that there's enormous goodness in religious ways of thinking, universal compassion and the ideas of ahimsa and so on. But that there are often also problems in that compassion ends up being constrained to an in-group or made conditional on following certain rules that were normally written a few hundred or a few thousand years ago, clearly by powerful men for their own ends. Or there's some overarching ultimate purpose that is more important than the suffering, death, life and flourishing of sentient beings. And unfortunately, because of that overarching superordinate goal, it tends to end up justifying quite a lot of suffering and death. So I find that difficult. And also the idea of the mystery. So I've been recently having yet another interminable Twitter conversation with someone about, is the idea of a benevolent God consistent with the prevalence of wild animal suffering, for example, a problem that's existed long before humans came on the scene and certainly long before religions deigned to tell us what this was all about. And again, one of the possible answers there that some people put forward is God is benevolent, but it's a sort of benevolence that you lowly humans just cannot understand. And I find that intellectually odd, But I also find it frightening, because if this deity is supposed to be the instantiation of the perfect good, and this good is of such a mysterious nature that we cannot understand it, and two, it seems to involve widespread, seemingly pointless suffering for quadrillions of beings, I'm not sure that's a great example to set. So I'm going on too long, but that's sort of my default mindset. There's some good there, but there's a lot of problems. Whereas Lisa's stance seems to be different. She seems to think that atheists like you and me, she struggles to get any moral lever to pull on to help us extend our compassion, whereas she seems to be much more positive about certainly engaging with the Judeo-Christian religions and Islamic religions and saying, look, you've got this compassion, let's extend it, and so on. So it's an interesting counterpoint, but I think I edge more towards your thoughts on the implications for ethics than I do to Lisa's so far. But
well, we start off, if you look back, the great chain of being, where there was a hierarchy. A lot of religion is just really based on discrimination, even when its tenets purport to be all-encompassing. I'm not just talking about now, where, of course, the Pope is at the moment in Canada apologizing for all the First Nations abuse, even the killing of children, or the neglect to the point of death of children, or the sexual abuse that has run rampant through the Catholic Church, or the fact that rabbis and Jains being, I adore Jains, the whole ethical concept of Jainism, I think it's just extraordinary. If we all adopted it, it really would be ahimsa, would be do no harm to any living being. But even they run slaughterhouses in India. Rabbis run slaughterhouses here. And we have in the US this ritual called Kaporis, where rabbis go out into the street and whirl live chickens, petrified little birds above their heads, and then abandon them, injured often, on the street. So religion has a lot to account for, and it always has, from the Crusades back to the great chain of being. It's quite hierarchical. And when I was in school, to go back to that, I can give you a practical example of the nuns would say, it's a feast day. So Roman Catholics would get special foods. They'd get cake. We didn't have very good food in school. They were very frugal with their meals. But we who were not Roman Catholic, I was Church of England, did not have that cake. And
amazing.
So at one point, I wrote to my parents and I said, I want to convert. I want to be RC. And my father, who was not RC, my mother was absolutely horrified and came up to the school to see what was going on and discovered it was because I wanted cake. And so, it's so ridiculous. When we look at, you can go to now, and I don't mean to pick on Roman Catholics. People are people all over the world. Whether you want religion as a crutch or you want it to help you get through life, or you earnestly believe that God is looking out for you and that you just can't understand why he is doing these things, there are problems. The St. Francis of Assisi church in Italy, they eat animals. St. Francis used to hold out his hand, apparently, according to what we're told, to have wild birds come and he would feed them. Yeah. And he was so kind and gentle. And if you try to talk to the monks at that church, that monastery, they have no interest. They're like anybody else. They just say, oh, no, go away. We want to continue with our bad habits. So I think a moral grounding is what's important, not belief in a real or fictitious being in the sky somewhere, but the belief that you can figure out in your own mind what is good. And as Galsworthy said, there are three important things in life. One is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. And if you can grasp how to be kind and set your mind to being kind and your deeds and words to being kind, then I think you've got the most wonderful, solid moral grounding you could ever imagine. You don't need anybody else to endorse it. You don't need a book to read about it. You can just do it.
Yeah. And you've already seamlessly answered my second question about what matters, and because often that is a challenge that's given to people with a naturalistic way of thinking, like you and me, that's more grounded in evidence and reason. We don't have this sort of superordinate God looking over our shoulder, judging us or telling us what right and wrong are. So people will say, well, okay, so how can you have any ethical grounding? Why aren't you running around and pillaging and murdering and just being completely egoistic? And I find that a bizarre challenge. It's getting less and less common these days, but it is a challenge we face. And I think you've answered it very straightforwardly, that in a sense it's a choice to be kind. Now, would you say that it is just a choice, or would you say there's some other rationale you might give for why we should be kind, and not just have a completely either egoistic ethic that is just about selfishly what I want, or a nihilistic ethic that says that nothing matters, it's all just physics, so ultimately nothing matters, or a relativistic ethic that just says it's just whatever a particular group happens to agree at a time. Is there something beyond that you would put forward as a rationale for being kind as your grounding?
Well, funny enough, I think a very simple answer for me is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is something that even very selfish people should be able to understand.
Yeah.
Because if you can relate, but not everybody can relate. There's this thing called the mirror neuron in your brain, which allows you to empathize depending on how well developed it is. And some people apparently don't have a mirror neuron, and some people have an underdeveloped mirror neuron, and they can never put themselves in the place of another. And you see this with serial killers. And there have been sociological studies where somebody who has been locked up for pretty ghastly, horrible, sadistic murders is shown a picture of a woman screaming and is amused by it or doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
And there has been
just processed in a different way.
Yes, the brain is not allowing that person to relate. And so they really can't help being not only callous, but beyond callous, to wish to inflict pain or to take pleasure from inflicting pain. I sometimes wonder if trophy hunters have a developed mirror neuron, because you do see them standing over a magnificent giraffe or elephant or water buffalo they've shot, grinning and looking so proud of themselves that they've felled this magnificent, independent living being. And so I think you can't always blame people for not caring or not understanding. It may be physiological. There are also other factors that come into play. But for the rest of us who can empathize and who are deeply affected by being able to read what you can read in other human beings or other species' faces, in their eyes, and bulls cry, cows cry, elephants cry, they shed tears. And you can see these manifestations of grief and loneliness and worry and pain. And we, of course, also have so many scientific studies now where almost every day, several times a day perhaps, we read a scientific study about sentience. And we read that animals do experience, even the tiniest of animals do experience all these emotions. They have an emotional life, an intellectual life, and so on. And yet, animal experimenters are not guided, their conduct is not governed by these scientific findings that other animals are just like us.
Yeah. And that's another area where these two topics overlap, because for some people, as you've said, there's an ethical failure. They don't care, they can't care, they're blocked by social norms from expressing that care. For other people, it's actually an epistemological failure. They genuinely, like Descartes, torturing his wife's dog, just don't believe that non-human animals have the capacity to experience things, which I find shocking given the overwhelming scientific evidence you just referred to as well. But then there are other epistemological failings around, can farming be humane? Various justifications that fall apart when you tend to dig into them. So yeah, it's a fascinating, challenging space where there's both epistemological blockers and ethical failures, I think.
There's also another reason I believe that incredible cruelty takes place. And that is, if you see it in nursing homes, you see it in prisons, you see it in all sorts of places. Abu Ghraib, for example. I don't believe that every single person who worked in Abu Ghraib thought it was all right to torture their prisoners. But and I worked in the sheriff's office and I saw it there too, is that it's a culture. And that if everyone's doing it, people knock sheep get together and flock and do things collectively for a reason. We do the same thing, but sometimes not for good reason. Is that if your flock is all going along with something, you do not wish to stick your head above the parapet and object. And I think that sort of reluctance to speak to your own ethics, to defend the victim or to defend those who can't defend themselves is a shortcoming.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd echo much of what you've said about going back to kindness as the root, kindness or compassion, because to me, almost definitionally, morality and ethics have to be about some form of concern for others. I mean, what else is it about? And as soon as we have any basic concern for others, we're concerned for their perspective, their view of the world, their experiences, their suffering, their flourishing. And in a way, kindness and compassion is just a way of saying, we care about those others. But there's a critical challenge here, which is, I think, nearly every human, putting the clinical sociopaths and psychopaths to one side, would acknowledge this idea of kindness. And I think nearly everyone is kind, at least to their immediate family members and companion animals and friends and family. But the question is, okay, who should we be kind to, and how far should that scope of compassion go? So I know it's a story you've told many places before, but what was your journey to extending that scope of compassion, particularly across the species boundary?
Well, I was an incredibly slow learner. At 19, I had a fur coat. Long before that, I was in Kashmir and I was in love with this hat that was made of a wild cat's fur that I would wear everywhere. And if we went anywhere in India, where I spent part of my growing up years, if it was a choice between a taxi and a horse-drawn carriage, a tonga, I would always say to my mother, "Oh, let's take the horse, let's take the horse." I had not connected the dots. I fished, I went deep sea fishing, all sorts of things. And of course, I ate every animal under the sun. My father was a gourmand, and we would eat everything except calf's liver on toast. He loved it, and I thought it was revolting. But what happened to me is one incident after another. And that shows, I think, how limited most of us are. If I'm any kind of example of human behavior, I loved animals from the moment I was growing up with that dog. And if a baby bird fell from a nest, I would feed them, a baby squirrel, that kind of thing. But I ate them, I wore them, I bought things that were experimented on them. We had, never mind, all the usual things. So I read later I read Peter Singer's book, and he put it in perspective for me that it's not just about being kind to certain animals, it's the fact that they are other nations trapped with us in the web of time and space, and that we are just one animal among many in the great orchestra of life and all that sort of stuff. But to show, I think, that when people say, "Oh, you just need to go directly to animal rights," I believe that it's important to state that we should have consideration for all animals, but to point out individual cruelties, because for me, those were stepping stones every bit of the way, where I found a pig on a farm when I was still eating pigs, who was starving. And I carried that pig to the vet to get him attention. He was dying. And the people had abandoned him. On the way home that night, before there were microwave ovens, I was thinking to myself, "Gosh, I'm hungry. I wonder what I've got to eat at home." And I thought, "Oh, good, I defrosted those pork chops." And then, the penny dropped. It clicked. I realized, hang on a minute, I'm about to prosecute people for cruelty to one pig, and I can't imagine the slaughterhouse is a pretty place where you'd go to have a picnic. I saw lobsters in the same way at a birthday celebration where they were brought live to the table, and I picked one. And when he came back to the table, suddenly I realized what I had done. I'd taken a life. So bit by bit, going into laboratories to inspect, I would change my behavior based on what I had seen and the realization that I didn't wish to contribute financially or otherwise to the perpetuation of the suffering that I was seeing in front of me. So I do believe we have to show people as much as we can. But reading Peter Singer's book brought it all home to me. He articulated what must have existed in the back of my brain and my consciousness, but which no one else had ever said to me. And apparently I was too slow to figure out for myself. And that is, we're all in this together, or we should be.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that Peter Singer's done is to talk, and Richard Ryder and Richard Brophy and others talked about this idea of anti-speciesism, of us looking at species and say, well, why is that morally salient? In the same way as we look at sex and race and gender and various other characteristics, and we've come to the conclusion that those things aren't morally significant either. We should have universal compassion. Let's look at species in that same context as well. And I think that's been a really powerful, analogous approach for many people. In a way, I think anti-speciesism is important in the same way as being anti other forms of discrimination are useful. But I think it's also useful to be able to say, okay, that's what we're against, but what is it that matters? And that's partly what's drawn me to this idea of sentience. And again, Richard Ryder was one of the earliest people to use the word sentientism in this context as well. So I think it's quite interesting to have the anti-side, the discriminations we're against. But the reasons we're against those discriminations is because all sentient beings should matter because of their sentience, because they, are entities in their own right with their own perspectives and their own interests and their own values. So, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Now, there's a couple of challenges to this sort of stance which I think you and I hold, that all sentient beings matter. One, obviously, is the anthropocentric pushback, which says, look, no, it's all about humans. And you can have a religious argument for that. You can have a warped naturalistic argument for that. I think they're all flawed, but let's put that to one side because I think it's just groundless to you and I. But there's another challenge, which is actually the first time the word sentientism was used that I've managed to track down was criticizing it and was saying, look, these ideas that people like Peter Singer and Richard Ryder and others are putting forward and the Godloviches are putting forward actually is a form of discrimination in its own right, because it's saying all sentient entities matter morally, but what about the non-sentient stuff? What about the biosphere and the plants and the rocks and the rivers and the trees and the ecosphere? And in a sense, the current cultural zeitgeist has picked up on a lot of that very strongly in the environmental context. And much of that is positive, as us humans start to worry about the sustainability of where we live, and people are jumping from an anthropocentric stance to say, the biosphere matters, the ecosphere matters. What do you think about those challenges to people who say, look, animal rights, sentientism, sentiocentrism, you're not going far enough? What about this other stuff?
You can go as far as you want. Obviously, people always, they use that argument. They'll say things like, for example, they've heard this for years, is would you swat a mosquito? And the purpose of saying it is to try to devalue your other beliefs. Or would you eat a plant? Well, there's so many arguments that say, well, if you are worried that plants are sentient, then don't eat cows because they eat so many more plants, and then you eat the cow and the plants.
Yeah. And the feed conversion ratio is shocking.
It's absolutely shocking. Yeah. So you could go on with that thing. I'm not at all sure about, and again, you know who does definitely feel pain, and you know if you are part of contributing to the cause of that pain. So just don't do it. You can get a bit waffly the further down you go. As for the environmental concerns, I believe that they are almost totally selfish. I don't believe that it's an expansion of anything. I believe people are suddenly faced with the fact that the human beings may not survive, and their grandchildren, doesn't stop them from having children, apparently. The future is dim, and so they're worried about that. Will the waters be there? Will there be enough water for everybody? Will the waters be too polluted to use? Will the air be too polluted to breathe? Will there be any natural places for us to go hiking? This is, I believe, a pretty humanocentric view.
Yeah.
I don't believe, because certainly you would start with what's on your own plate and your own back and your own feet and what you're buying and how much you're buying and so on, and expand it. So sure, you can expand it, but what reason are you expanding? To me, it's like you shouldn't just be a feminist because you're a woman. It was, there was a Vietnam War, and a lot of people said over here, I won't go. I'm not going to go to war. That was understandable. I mean, they were going to go and probably get killed if they were in the infantry. And so, all right, fine. But you should be against war totally, about other people being killed and about, other people in other countries, religions, whatever it is. And again, if you're in a religion, that's fine. I'm going to help protect you if I can. From harm, but it shouldn't be so separatist. It's the Bridget Brophy thing again, and she was brilliant in her writing. Is that you need to expand your vision? There needs to be a principle here, and I mean, if I kick a rock, I hurt my own foot. I'm not sure I hurt the rock, but if I kick a dog or a cow or a chicken, I know I'm hurting that living being. So go as far as you want, but the big thing is take the first step, is what you absolutely know, fix it. And don't just be in something because it's going to affect you, or if you are, make sure it also helps others if you're going to try to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, a previous guest described the centre of gravity of the modern environmental movement as more of a veneer on anthropocentrism than a genuine expansion of moral concern, and I think that's entirely fair. It doesn't apply to everybody, but the test is easy, as you've said already. The test is, if you're genuinely expanding, then you grant moral consideration to all of the sentient wild animals and all of the sentient farmed animals, and you put that into practice. And then, fine, if you want to go beyond that to plants and ecosystems and rocks and rivers and trees, which I would too, instrumentally, because I care about the impact on all the sentient beings, I'm much more concerned about sentient beings being excluded than if people want to go beyond sentience. That's fine, if you like. But we already know, as you say, we have a high degree of confidence that so many of these beings are sentient, obviously, and we harm and kill them for trivial reasons. So if we want to be consistent, and surely we should.
We also sort of pseudo-protect them for frivolous reasons and humanocentric reasons. I know the puffin, for example, or I should say puffins, because they're not just anyway, is that they have been preserved in many places because people were sad that they didn't see them anymore. And there is this Disney-like idea that we should be able to see and our grandchildren should be able to see. And so rather than be respectful and leave them in peace and let things evolve as they evolve naturally, we want to preserve, which means manage certain populations. And that's disrespectful of them too. I mean, you can see bison and wolves in Yellowstone, and we didn't have any. We wiped them out, so we brought them back, and now we're wiping them out again. It's as if they don't have individuality, or you don't think they have thoughts and feelings and partnerships and their loves and family and so on. You're just going to manage them as a thing. So,
yeah, I agree entirely. And there's another challenge, and this might be a little bit cheeky, but I do sometimes look at even the animal advocacy movements and the vegan movement, and sometimes think that they can be quite anthropocentric too, in that they have an understandable focus on human-caused harms. So, the common definition of veganism is about avoiding causing suffering, death, and exploitation as far as we can. But there's an implication there that even if we imagine a sort of perfect vegan world where we've completely ended animal farming and exploitation and research and testing and use for entertainment, and so humans have just stopped doing that completely. We've completely transitioned away, that the job is completely finished. And there's an interesting developing area of thought, and some of my previous guests have written on it, Carl Johansson and others like Oscar Horter and Katia Faria, thinking about the ethics of wild animal suffering. And it can be quite contentious because, understandably, the reaction of the average animal advocate is, but look at the egregious horror of what humans are doing. We can control that. That should be the priority. Let's do that. Let's not think about it, which is a priority argument, which I might agree with. But there are others who will almost want to completely withdraw our compassion for wild animals, either because of a naturalistic fallacy that just assumes things that are in nature are by definition good. So who cares about the starvation and the victims of predation, or for some other reason. So I should ask you an open question rather than setting out my story. What's your thoughts about non-human caused wild animal ethics and wild animal suffering?
I think it's too thorny, and I think it's none of our business, frankly, until we've cleaned our own house. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly look and say, just as I said, with people with no mirror or an undeveloped mirror neuron, is that maybe they don't have the capacity to be kind. And in nature, you see that certain animals will play with their living prey, and maybe they don't have the capacity to see. I wouldn't condemn them. It's simply they don't have the capacity for it. But I mean, this is getting a little bit how many angels can dance on the head of a pin when we have so much to do in our own lives personally. And we're talking about insect sentience now. There are things coming out every day about, bees and their pain and suffering. And unfortunately, a lot of that is done in experiments in laboratories where we cause pain and suffering to small fish and limpets and bees and so on, so that we can learn to do what? I don't know. We don't seem to correct our own behavior. I would stay closer to home. And I mean, as an intellectual exercise, it's fascinating. As a philosophical exercise, it's fascinating. There's too much work to be done in where I sit at my table to go there at the
And
moment.
I'm quite open to that priority call, as long as we don't withdraw our compassion, as long as we recognise the salience of it. And I think there's an interesting parallel, because in the same way as I'm not really that interested in whether a lion is a moral agent that we can blame for the terrible wrong it's doing by killing a gazelle, even though it has no choice, right? In the same way as you talked about the psychopath earlier on, can you really blame someone in that sort of classical sense for something they have a proclivity to do? And you can take it all the way to denying free will and so on, which is a different topic we can go to. But in a way, that's less interesting to me than the moral salience of the experience of the victim, and whether someone's killed by someone genuinely evil or a psychopath or a wild animal. To the victim, they're not too bothered about the status of moral agency of who's doing it to them. Their suffering matters. And that's the thing I think, at least intellectually, we should hold on to. There may well be other priorities, and we need a lot of humility, given the track record of humans in intervening in the world there too. But yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you. Let's leave that topic there, because I want to respect your time too. And I've got one more even bigger question to answer in 10 minutes that you've spent almost your entire life addressing. So the final big question is, we've answered what's real and what and who matters. The final question is, how can we make a better world? And you've founded and led, as you said, the world's biggest animal advocacy organization at enormous scale and unarguable impact. And some people absolutely love the work you do, the style, the approach, the tone, the unashamed stridency of it, and other people will criticize you for the levers you pull and the tone and the style and how you engage with the world. But through that amazing experience, how do you think about making a better future? And you can talk either about a utopian end state we might be able to get to, or more pragmatically how we can drive change, given that, as we've talked about, I think for you and me, the answers are quite obvious on the ethical basis and the epistemological basis, but these social norms are so powerfully in our way. It's too big a question, but how do you think about driving positive change?
Well, I'm not a crystal ball sort of person, and I tend to think we'll probably never reach a utopia. You just look around and you see how many wars human beings are waging against each other, and you look at all the things that are going on that are unpleasant, that are outside the other animals' world. So my concentration is on how to reach anybody and everybody as often as possible with as many practical ways in which they can change the world for animals as I can figure out or others can suggest. And every 5 minutes is something else that comes along. But basically, we all eat. So that's really simple. 3 times a day, not counting snacks, you can make some ethical decision. And I don't think there is anybody who, unless they've lived in a cave, fails to recognize what's happening on factory farms, but also the idea not just of that, but of the fear that animals are experiencing in farming, in laboratories, in the exotic skins trade with snakes cut up and pumped full of water while they're still alive. all these things. There are so many videos on the internet, so many things have been said, so many exposés, that really we have to push hard to challenge people to change what they're doing. The other thing that I think is very, very important is a movement. Any movement, social movement, has to grow. And that means that although people send me letters and email messages all day saying, look, I've just discovered some horror. Can you at PETA fix it? Can you make it go away? Can you save all these animals? And there's certainly so many examples that your head spins. I try to turn it back. Yes, we'll do all we can, but I try to turn it back as I'm just a person. You're just a person. An organization is made up of just a bunch of people. So please, will you take personal responsibility? And then how do you get people to take personal responsibility? Is perhaps they feel, you can make them feel guilty. You can make them feel angry. You can make them empowered. You can make them see how convenient and easy it is and how little it will take of their time, or how it won't take any time at all just to change some simple thing from A to B. So we try a scattershot approach, and almost everything we do offends somebody, as you said. But people are all different, and one approach may appeal to somebody and upset another. And so we try humor, we try sex, we try seriousness, we try shock, we try everything to say, is there something here that resonates with you? And so can we also make change practical and easy for you? We'll provide the resources. We'll show you what to eat, what to wear, where to go on your holiday, what you can buy that doesn't cause suffering in laboratories. And we'll empower you to make your consumer voice heard. Because after all, this is a consumer-based society. You can be as red a socialist as you like. We're stuck with it. This is it. So we have to try to persuade people to use their power of the purse or their whatever it is to influence the people who want to sell them things, to sell them something that doesn't cause pain and suffering, and stop selling them things that does. So, that's a very simplistic, generalized view.
Yeah.
But
and the scattershot approach, it sounds to me, is a response to, I guess, just the diversity of humans in a sense, because there are some, and many of them are among my guests, who are obviously quite a weird bunch of people. I mean that in the kindest possible way.
Thank you.
Because a number of them have cited seeing really hard-hitting literature, a pamphlet from PETA, as the thing that shocked them into action. So there's a subset of humanity who, a shock, a direct challenge, a shaming, a guilt, a sort of really punchy, viscerally difficult engagement can be the thing that changes them or puts them on a different path. But then again, there are lots of other humans who that sort of approach puts them off. They double down. They go even deeper into denial. They can get tribal and push back even harder. So I guess that your scattershot approach is an attempt to sort of address that diversity and sort of, we don't know what's going to work, but let's try lots of things. But one of the challenges, as you said, you face, because almost everything you do gets criticised, is how do you think about the limits you need to draw around that? And you mentioned the use of sex, and I know you've been criticised by people coming from a feminist angle on that perspective. There are different challenges about how we might leverage intrahuman ethics and exploitation in the way we talk about non-human animals. Do you have a sense of where the limits are? And obviously with the book behind you, there's a question there about even the use of violence or damage to physical property, or I don't know how to put this, but we're dealing with such a obvious, egregious horror that can lead you to all sorts of means being justified. How do you find a way with kindness and compassion of drawing the right limits?
Well, if you'll let me, because you did mention we've been criticized for the use of sex, let me say, as a feminist, a dyed-in-the-walls feminist, that I find it extremely sexist for people, especially men, not you, but for men, to say, get your clothes back on. If I don't want to have my clothes on, that's my business. And
Yeah.
everybody who has posed naked or pretending to pose naked, they've often got something in front of them. Doesn't really matter. It's their business and they're volunteers. No one's paying them. So I think this isn't Afghanistan where your brother or your father or your husband tells you to cover up.
Yeah.
It's all very
Not yet.
arbitrary. So not yet, not yet. In America, we may be getting there. So to me, if you want to expose your breast or your ear, neither bothers me in the slightest. So I really object to that. And I think there are different waves of feminism that have different views. But to return to your question, I think in the book I talk about how there was a split in the Animal Liberation Front members in North America, where some decided that they would set fire to things, buildings, and so on. And to their credit, they were always very, very careful. They went in first to make sure that there were no living beings that they could detect there before they did it. But I am opposed to physical violence of any great importance. I've certainly been beaten up myself and attacked and accosted, assaulted, and all those things. It wasn't pleasant, but I lived. I don't think you should kill anybody for your beliefs. I mean, we're seeing this now and we have been with abortion and so on, is that to save this unborn child or fetus, whichever you prefer, you'll kill the person who is going to take that life. I don't believe in that. I don't like the whole concept. Something very ugly and uncomfortable and just wrong seeming about it. But as for property, I do believe with all my heart that if you see property like a decapitator or an electrode implanter or some device that's used to cause misery, pain, to torture any living being, human or not, that it is a moral imperative, if you can, to destroy it so that it cannot be used to cause harm. But that's my limits there. But of course, each to his own. I do admire the people who have broken into laboratories and other places and taken animals out and destroyed the video machines, the head crashing apparatus, all those sorts of things. Because I always think, at very basic level, if my dog were in there, and what would I do? Write a polite letter and hope somebody listened, or bang on the door and hope somebody answered? And if they didn't, would I just walk away and get on with my life while she was there, hoping that somebody would come and get her? So breaking the law, when people say, oh, I would never break the law. Every social movement in history has had people break the law. You don't have to. The question I think you have to always ask yourself is, what am I doing legally? Perhaps. What am I doing legally? There are certainly lots of options to change things. You don't have to break the law. If someone else does and it brings about good, then thank goodness they did it.
Yeah, thank you. Given your experience, and I know you said you're not a crystal ball gazer, how does that leave you feeling about our future collectively, or sentient beings in general? Some people are very much on the end that humanity, it's just impossible to save us because we've gone so far astray from a sort of universal compassion. Other people are much more optimistic that given the history of other social change movements, we could fix both, intrahuman ethics globally. It'll never be done, but, substantially we can continue to make really good progress. But we can also make serious progress across the species boundary. We can transition to end animal farming and find different alternatives and other ways of avoiding animal exploitation. What's your sense of where our trajectory as a species is going to go? Can we turn the ship around?
I don't believe we can turn the big ship around. I'm no Julie Andrews. What I believe there is an imperative to do is look around you today and think, good grief, we've just created an awful mess, and do what you can. Where it'll end up, who knows? And I won't be here to see it. I just feel that we should do what we can today and tomorrow, and as long as we're around, to make a world in which there is less suffering, less injustice, less oppression, less needless violence. And that's as far as I'll go.
Yeah, thank you. It's an important call to arms. Draw us back to the present day and the practicalities. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation and a real pleasure to talk to you. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, buying your 30th edition, 30th anniversary book?
I do think that the book is a great eye-opener of what's happening today, and the really true stories, of uplifting stories of what the animal liberation people did to get animals out and to wake people up. It's Free the Animals. It's the 30th edition. Joaquin Phoenix did the foreword, and he's bought the movie rights, which I'm delighted about.
Will he star?
I don't know. I'd love him to. It's on Amazon.com. It's on the PETA website. It should be in lots of stores if people go to stores. The big thing is you don't have to believe a lot of what I believe in, or almost any of it, except the kindness part.
Yeah.
But put a toe in the water, please, if you're interested. We do have enormous resources, everything from vegan starter kits to options to dissection, clothing lists, cruelty-free cosmetics, you name it. PETA.org is the website. And any way we can help anyone do anything that will alleviate suffering, reduce suffering, make it a kinder world, we're there for you.
Thank you. An inspiring message to close on. Think today and think kindness. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Jamie.